chapter 13, and this is quite a chapter that to end with here in the text. Two big broad things is who controls education and how is it funded, but boy, we're going to run all over the place here. You're going to have to work hard to keep up because we're going to talk about, the state organization, from the role of the governor and, chief of the staff, the Department of Ed, those right down to local, like superintendents and the principal, what their responsibilities are, school boards. We're going to be all over the place. I think it's enjoyable. Maybe set you on a path to other endeavors in education other than teaching. Maybe to be a principal or superintendent someday, or a business manager or something like that. But I'll introduce you to it here and what those roles are. So come along, keep up, and be ready. Chapter 13. On part 3, the forces that shape educational policies and practices. But chapter 13, who controls and finances education? Now let me tell you, going in, very, very political. Your textbook, wrote by Savage from Merrill, is very, very one-sided. Pulls very, very hard one way in the political spectrum. Just so you know that going in, what you're getting here. Well, what about the questions concerning who controls education and finances? It are vital issues that influence the future of education and the role of teachers. Basic questions are this: how much money is needed, and who should pay? Okay, and this one makes it one-sided because this textbook is very concerned with these things. Has a very strong attitude: who should pay, and what it costs. How should the money be allocated, and who should be held accountable for those results? Okay, let me just tell you this on this also is there's pretty solid research that no matter how many dollars you put in, it doesn't seem to raise the achievement. And so that's always the underlying things that one side will say. So this is your textbook, broke into two parts: who controls and how is education financed. And under this is like the state organizations and the intermediate districts and the local districts, then federal organizations, and then it gets all gobbed up from here. So I'll try and sort through this for you, but stay with me on this. So what's that relationship? These are just focus questions. You don't have to answer these. What's that relationship between the responsibility of the local school, state, and federal government? Which state models of education are influenced by politics? How is a typical school district organized? And that's a little easier to understand. You have a little bit of a knowledge of that already. How do professional education associations influence this? Remember, we talked about a couple. Obviously, here's a big one that has a lot of influence. By far the biggest. Has a lot of money. This group has a lot of money to lobby and influence policy that way. How's the source of revenue influence educational policy? What's the relationship between equity and adequacy models for funding education? And this is a big political football also to throw back and forth. When does an increased control over education result in a negative or a positive consequences? And how do shifts from local sources of revenue to state sources impact education policy? That's what we're seeing right now is a huge influence on federal. Federal government wants to put money in your schools. What influence is that going to have on your school? How do current teacher compensation plans compare and proposed payment plans? So first of all, the 12th Amendment, this is very interesting, the 12th Amendment of the Constitution reserves those powers not delegated to the federal government to the states. The 12th Amendment said anything we haven't mentioned in the Constitution goes to the state. Because education is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Did you know that? The Constitution doesn't mention education. Government of education has been delegated to the states until now. The federal government is going to take over education. And all educational activities within the state are subject to the control of the state. The state enacts legislation, binding all schools, determines the financing formulas for those schools, determines the criteria for granting and revoking teacher administrators' credentials, accredit schools, and may determine the textbooks to be used in the schools. This never used to happen. This is new. But now we do this. How do we do this now? Well, with state tests. Okay, so they had policies, but they determine the finance for the school, how we're going to give you that. And we've talked about this before, that the state is the one that issues teacher license and administrator license, called credentials. And they also accredit the school to say, hey, you're accredited, meaning you're meeting minimum standards. All that the state gets to do. So that state organization has influenced this. Legislature and the governor is one level. There's a chief state school officer. We have a different name for it here. And there's a state school board of education. And then there's a state department of education. So there's 4 levels of bureaucracies in the state to run schools. So first of all, don't let this scare you. You don't need all this, but I just wanted this. I stole all your textbook. Legislature and governor. The state legislature is the most influential body in controlling education in the state because this body establishes educational policy and passes the laws that govern education. Who's the most influential? State legislature. One thing they decide is the money. Every state, numerous bills are introduced in any given year relating to education. Recent years, an interest in education increase, so has the action in legislatures regarding education. Most states have had a dramatic increase in the number of bills introduced pertaining to some dimensions of education. If you don't understand state government, how a bill becomes law, this doesn't mean anything to you. In some instances, court decisions have forced. This is what's interesting, is this is how they can be. You can fight. It has been fought against. Is the courts take action? For example, court decisions regarding the legality of school financing have prompted legislation in many states. State governors have potential for exerting considerable influence on education because they have the power to veto. Again, if you don't understand government, this doesn't mean anything to you, but they can veto a bill that are passed by the legislature. In addition, they can use the power of their office to lobby and influence public opinion in the legislature. For example, Governor Schwarzenegger in California exerted considerable political pressure on voters to pass state bond issues for adding and replacing school facilities. Together, state legislatures and the governor act on state budgets that contain funding for local schools. Many state governors have emphasized education in their elections. For example, their stands on education played a significant role in the elections of Bill Clinton as governor in Arkansas, George Bush as governor of Texas. In 2006 campaigns, education platforms were key issues in the gubernatorial elections. And I tried to do this in each one, tell you where I got that in page 344. Now I want to go back into the Governor Schwarzenegger, California. He exerted a lot of influence because he wanted some of these schools replaced, but you realize California is the most corrupt and busted state in the union, that they are so poor that now they can't make their payments to pay the teachers and pay their staff and things like that. So here's a time where governor was very irresponsible with his political pressure on the legislature to spend money. See, I tell you, they don't tell you that. You only get that from here, from me. Well, what is a chief state school officer? Have you heard of that? What do we call that? What do we call that person in South Dakota? Well, another key education figure within a state is the chief state school officer. This position has different titles in many states. Most common are a state superintendent of education or state commissioner of education. This individual is often viewed as the voice for education within a state. The actual power of this person varies according to the governance structure in the state. In some states, they may have considerable power to influence educational policy, and in others, they have very limited input. The person in this role is often the executive officer for the State Board of Education and the chief administrator for the State Department of Ed. And in our case, that is true. That person has both of those roles, the chief executive officer for the State Board of Ed and the chief administrator of the Department of Ed. Have you thought of what we call ours yet? Our chief state school officer? Hang on. Then there's a State Board of Education. The actual implementation of those laws and policy requires a bureaucracy. Do you know what that term is? Bureaucracy. This is the first one you get to look up in your notes, is bureaucracy. Write a definition here. Open this and put a definition here of bureaucracy. To interpret the laws and implement policies. This is the responsibility of State Board of Education, the State Department of Ed, and the chief state school officer. So it's often those laws and stuff are passed by whom? Right, the state legislatures. And now this group, this bureaucracy comes in involve the State Board of Ed, Department of Ed, and that chief state school officer. They get to implement. And really kind of interesting because sometimes this law and policies that are passed by legislatures are implemented way different than they had visions. And what I thought is at times was a little odd is the power this bureaucracy has without being elected. But who's asking? State Board is the body that sets the goals and the priorities for education in the state. And it establishes those curricular offerings the state's going to have. And here's the one that affect you is the state standards. This group of people here, this State Board, Department of Ed, Chief State School Officer, get to establish the state standards. In other words, what we're going to test your students on, those state standards. And they also enforce regulations on the local school districts. They establish education code, make recommendations to the governor and the state legislatures on educational issues. So they get to do a lot of things. This bureaucracy has a lot to do with running the schools in the state. For example, members of the State Board believe that the standards for obtaining a teaching credential need to be revised. We'll work with members of the state legislature to draft a bill addressing this need. In addition, if a bill relating to education is passed in the legislature, the State School Board will oversee the implementation of that. State Board. Now, what is the name of the chief state school officer in our state? Anyone? Anyone? Well, then we're talking about the different ones. There's that school officer, here's that Department of Ed, and now, this is the Board of Ed, now the Department of Ed. What do? Well, the State Department of Ed is the body that carries out the work. And you'll find that a number of the employees in all of these are former teachers, or maybe not former, but certainly have teaching in their background or credential. But they carry out the work of that Board of Education because education is a given a state. It's complex. The State Department often has a significant number of departments. Got to have lots of government, big departments, especially in education, and employees. State Department of Education performs tasks such as compiling statistical reports. Got to have paperwork, got to have reports, administering the budget, overseeing how the money is spent in our schools, and establishing curriculum frameworks. They're carrying that out from the Board of Ed and the State Chief Officer. And content standards, which you'll be following in your classrooms, and establishing standards for teaching credentials. And this will be big for you because you will not be licensed as a teacher until you've met the requirements for the teaching credential, including all the standardized tests that are involved. And evaluating existing education programs. Those entering the education profession will have their most direct contact with the State Department of Ed, education through that credentialing process. Means you getting your credential, you getting your license, you getting your teaching certificate. Those are all another words for credentialing. Now, you want to talk intelligent, you want to talk educated about this, you are working towards a teaching credential. That's an educated word. State Department establishes the standards of the teacher preparation program, administers any test required for admission to the completion of teacher ed programs, and teacher candidates usually apply to the credentialing division of the State Board for their credential. Because education is primarily a state responsibility, each state has its own requirements. You know that? For that teaching credential, each state gets to set their own. For example, if you decide to move from the state where you complete your teacher ed, like here in South Dakota, you will need to meet the requirements of the state you move to in order to have that. This may mean taking a licensing examination required by that state. Several states have reciprocal agreements, meaning back and forth, that allow an individual with a credential from one state to begin teaching in another. However, the state may have additional requirements that must be met before the credential can be renewed. Now, let me tell you this. I don't know the other states, but if you get your credential someplace else and you move to South Dakota, you have to take a course in South Dakota Indians history. Have to do it. Have to do it. Okay, you go to Minnesota, it might be a different course. But for the most part, if you have a teaching credential, say for example, to be a social studies teacher in high school or an elementary teacher, whichever state you go to, that's going to be good, with the exception that you may need to add a course or two, or as it said here, you may have to take an additional exam of some kind, a licensing exam. Otherwise, it's pretty transferable. And most states got to have a grace period. So, for example, you come to South Dakota from Minnesota and you want to teach third graders. we'll give you like 2 years to get your credential current. And in that 2 years, we'll let you teach. But you got to have a current teacher certification from Minnesota in your hand, or don't talk to us. Okay. So if you figured out what we call this person, this chief school officer in South Dakota, we call him the Secretary of Ed. Secretary of Education. Okay? There. Now you're educated in South Dakota. We don't have a chief state school officer. We have a Secretary of Education. We call all of our cabinet people secretaries in the Department of Ed. So what is that structure of education control beyond that? Well, state governance model. There are several governance models used by states. In 25 states, the governor appoints all state board members and some members in 14 states. In 24 states, the chief state school officer is appointed in the state school board, and the governor appoints them in 12 and 14. Okay, so these are different models, and you get to figure out how we do it here. So, in the local structure, first of all, the local district. Local districts operate schools, hire teachers, purchase supplies, run buses, build and maintain buildings, feed the students, perform all tasks related and keep the school running. They keep the school running. The local school keeps the school running. They don't set policies. They keep the school running. Local districts are established by the state and are subject to regulation of the state. The state can change the boundaries. There's been some controversy over the years saying, oh, you used to be in that school district, now you're in this one, the state changes it. They can modify the powers of local school board or even eliminate school districts. Yikes. Yes, a little talk in South Dakota consolidation, but sometimes for other reasons say that school doesn't exist anymore. In recent years, some states have assumed control of local school districts because of poor performance and financial difficulties. This was a big talk with No Child Left Behind, was sometimes the states would have to move in. When you see the video that goes with this, you'll understand what I'm saying about failing schools. But nonetheless, that's a local district, how they run. Currently, the United States have about 14,000 local school districts covering almost 96,000 schools, teaching over nearly 50 million students. This is right out of your textbook. This represents a dramatic decline in the number of school districts and schools over the past 50 years. In 1940, there were 117,000 public school districts. Now there's 14,000. What happened to them all? They had 226,000 schools. Now there's 96. Where did they go? Well, it's a reduction result of school and school districts consolidations. For example, in 1940, there were 113,001 teacher schools, and that was the big reason. Every school, it used to be like this. You had every 6 miles in the country had to have every 6 square miles was a township and had to have a school. 1 acre set aside in that township for that school. Well, as you can imagine now, even in eastern South Dakota, there's no way, there's not even one family every 6 sections of land. Okay, but everyone, the old one-room schoolhouses were a result of that model, and that's why there were so many. But so as they left the landscape, for example, my wife went to country school till she was in through 1st grade, I believe. And then that school closed, and then they went to town school, they called it. But her and her whole family went to country school while she was in 1st grade. So in 2003 and 4, there were only about 376 376 one-room schools left. And there's still a few in South Dakota, but I know in very recent years they've closed more of them here in South Dakota. So what about that structure of local districts? Most districts have these common features. First of all, they have a school board, a superintendent, central office staff, principals, and teachers and school staffs. So let's look at these different things from the local schools. Well, first of all, there's the school board. You all heard of school boards. You all know about school boards and elections, and some of your families served on school boards, and let's find out what they do. They're legal authority for operating school districts, rests in the hands of the local school board. Local school board members are official agents of the state. Do you know that? When you're elected, you become an agent of the state. You represent the state as well as the local. The local school board is the only body that can legally bind the school district. This means that any action to be legal, such as contracting with districts for services, It must be approved by the board. This is important for new teachers to understand because actions such as employment of a new teacher, is not official until the board has acted and entered the action into the board minutes. Principal or superintendent offers you a contract, you sign it, but you are not a legal employee until the board acts on it and says, "I," and then you are then bound by it. And you realize a lot of schools, when you resign, the board has to enact on that too. Anyway, nobody talks about that. Even though a principal or personnel director may indicate a prospective teacher that district is going to employ them, the legal decision is made with the board. Local board usually consists of elected individuals who reside in the school district. A few school boards are appointed by the mayor. Normally, school board members cannot be employees of local school district. I know my mother-in-law, who's been passed away for a long time, she was employed. She was a first grade teacher, kindergarten teacher, and her husband, my father-in-law, was on the board. Now, how that worked, I don't know. But however, teachers who reside in the district but teach in another district may serve on the board, members of that district where they reside. And we have lots of examples of that somebody teaches in another district but's on their own local board. However, the vast majority of school board members are usually lay people, meaning people that aren't involved in the school, or residents and live within the boundaries, and that's a big one. Almost all districts have that. Because education is big business, school districts have large budgets, as you can imagine. A fair number of local school board members tend to have businesses and management backgrounds. Usually the terms of school board members are staggered so that there are always some continuing members on the board. In spite of power, responsibility of school board members usually serve with little or no compensation, usually a token amount of money instead of a salary. Local boards have responsibilities for staffing schools, including the selection of district superintendent. That's a big one, is they select this person and he hires everybody else. Establishing policies, procedures, daily operation of the schools. They develop a budget, keep the school district solvent, dealing with employee relations such as collective bargaining, developing curriculum, maintaining community, making decisions. He or she's a busy person because they oversee all this. They don't do all these things. They're responsible for all these things. Regarding such matters as extracurricular activities, requirements for promotion, graduation, grading, reporting procedures that again, you'll want to see the video viewpoint about the failing schools. So one of the most important functions of that board is to select that superintendent. In a few places, the superintendent is elected, but for most, that's an exception. Because the board consists of members who have limited experience, the board superintendent is the educational leader. District superintendents can have an enormous impact. Their most important role is that of providing leadership, saying how we're going to do things, holding people accountable. Superintendent must advise the school board about educational issues. We expect him to be the expert, and not only he communicates that leadership to the teachers in the school building, but he also communicates that to the board and brings them along on that. Overseeing development of the budget, maintaining a positive relationship with the community, and building support for schools and district programs. So that's a very key point. As you can see, a superintendent was a wide range of responsibilities in some large urban districts within extensive budgets where superintendents must deal with organized, special interest groups. And, political pressure from mayors and manage a complex organization with lots of employees. School boards have selected superintendents because of criteria other than their educational experiences. Why? Because they have all these other political footballs to play with. For example, the school board for a huge Los Angeles school district has selected former governor of Colorado as an admiral as superintendents. State board in Seattle selected a former general. This means that these superintendents do not have expertise as instructional leaders. They are more like a CEO of a large corporation, providing organization and management expertise, but are not knowledge of the day-to-day activities. In some large, complex districts, the superintendent is not expected to be an instructional leader because of that. But you cannot believe the pressure today on these people to hire good teachers and to meet yearly goals in yearly progress from No Child Left Behind, and to hire the right number of minorities and not to discriminate, and have a good special ed program and save money and not overspend and have good buildings. It's quite a job, and some of these superintendents make a very, very good salary because of that responsibility. The wide range of superintendent responsibilities also brings a high degree of risk. Yes, they must maintain positive support from a wide range of constituents, and it's almost inevitable that there will be some trouble. Some will there will be what? Some that disagree with them. Superintendent must maintain a positive relationship with the school board, because the school board can remove the superintendent at any time. They can fire and hire. So, kind of make nice with them. Make nice with the board. Maintain a strong support for the school board can be difficult in communities where there is conflict. There is composition of the school board frequently changes. So here it is. That's what that means. Here's these nice 6, 7, 8 people, 9 people on a school board. They hire you. They like you. You're their person. They interviewed 5 people. They searched the world, find 5 people to interview, and they picked you out, and they pay you $200,000 or $300,000 to run the school. Now the next year, we have a school board election, and now I have 3 new people, and I'm making a lot of money, and they're ran for the school board because they're kind of mad about things that went on in the board. They're kind of mad about some of the things you're doing as superintendent, and next year 3 more go off. Now there's six new people out of 9 on the school board that didn't hire me, and now there's enough to say, we're not really thrilled with the job you're doing anymore. Goodbye. My credential, I have a credential to be a superintendent and a principal. In fact, I thought that's what I was going to do until God led me a different way. But the professor I had in one of the classes to be superintendent, he had a saying that he would say several times through each class, "The bullet's on the way, the bullet's on the way." And that meant, and he explained this many times, is in a lot of these districts, when they hire you, it's only to fire you. It's kind of like now, like the manager of the Major League Baseball or the NBA. We only hire you knowing we're not going to have you very long. We're going to fire you. And so he would say things like that. The bullet's on the way. As soon as you sign the paper, somebody fires the bullet. It's on the way to get to you. And he would say, don't buy a house, rent a place, because you won't be there long. Of course, some of that was facetious, but you cannot imagine in some of the bigger districts in the country like Minneapolis, the amount of money and the political pressure there is on positions. And they pay that person a lot of money, but they earn every cent of it. Special interest groups can easily influence the composition of that board by turning out voters who share their views. And this is what I said before. It's so political, and somebody's usually mad about something. Election of even one new board member can change the balance of the power of that board. For this reason, the turnover rate of superintendents is quite high. One study found that the average tenure of superintendent is only 6 years. If you teach in a school district with any length of time, it's likely that you will work under several school superintendents, and you're very aware of that now. Okay, and then from the superintendent there is a central office staff. Even though the superintendent is responsible for the daily operations of the school district, the central office staff is a network of individuals with expertise in different areas that advise the superintendent. It usually consists of individuals who have responsibility for business and finance, human resource, curriculum and instruction, facilities, and special services, special federal programs, and special ed. The size of the central office staff is related to the size of the school district. Many of you came from small districts where there wasn't a central office staff. The superintendent had a secretary, and that was a central office staff. I worked in the Sioux Falls School District, and my kids go to school here in Sioux Falls, and they have a huge organization away from the school building that they have this exact setup of business and human resource and curriculum and instruction, special services and federal programs and special ed. They have all kinds of, we call them assistant superintendents. And they make a lot of money, and they're responsible for a lot of things, and they all report to the superintendent, who reports to anyone? Anyone? Right, the school board, yay! Small districts may have a small central office staff and individuals having multiple responsibilities. Large districts may have several levels of central office staff, including associate superintendents, superintendents, and director and coordinators. And that is exactly right. So we have the soup, now the central office staff, and now some more on that. One issue often arises in operation of the school district is the office staff tends to be more permanent than the superintendent. Why is that a problem? Well, because members of the central office staff are usually local individuals who have been in the district for a long time. Many of them are former teachers and principals who have moved through the ranks to that central office. And, that's very common here in Sioux Falls. That happens all the time. That the central office is full of people that moved up through the ranks. It happens to be in Sioux Falls. The superintendent is also, but quite commonly it's not. The result is most have developed local networks. So in theory, even though the central office staff is supposed to be supportive of the superintendent, in reality, let me get to that. This may not be the case. Some central office staff will. In reality, this may not be the case. Some of the central office staff have more loyalty to local constituents than to the superintendent. So in other words, we're here with the homies. We're all from here. The new guy comes to town, has a whole different ideas, start making changes, moving stuff around, doing things weird, we don't like it, and now we're mad. Therefore, they may be difficult to work with and may resist the leadership and authority of the superintendent. That, as you can imagine, is kind of bad, that he's in charge. He or she sets up this whole network. The local people don't like that, start to complain. One of the important and sometimes frustrating tasks superintendent is to win over those central office members and obtain their support, especially if some of them applied to be the superintendent and didn't get the job. Then it really gets kind of ugly. So the superintendent's challenged with that. Report to the board, win over the local people, spend money, all those kinds of things. Read this stuff out of textbooks, you guys. It's going to be part of this on the test. And then we go down from the superintendent to the principal. Normally the school principal is in charge of the operations of a local school. Principals are part of the administrative team and serve under the superintendent and the school board. Although most school principals are experienced teachers who have acquired tenure as a teacher, they do not acquire tenure as a school principal. Did you know that? That there continually be what's called an at-will. Like in South Dakota, we have an at-will policy that they can be fired. That unlike the teachers that get tenured after 3 years, here principals are at-will, mean they can be fired anytime. And they can be returned to other abilities such as teaching by the superintendent. And that's really bad when he comes in new. But we determine your building isn't making progress, people aren't getting along, not unusual to remove the principal and either move them to another building or back to teaching. Principals usually interview prospective teachers, and that's the way it is in Sioux Falls. The principals do the hiring. The central office handles the paperwork. We call it a paper screen, and make sure that you meet requirements and stuff. And then they have a list of potential candidates that they pass to the building principal when that principal has an opening. And that principal also manages the school budget, not for the district, just for their building. Like in Sioux Falls, we talk about building people, meaning that just their school building. Because in Sioux Falls, I think we have like 24 elementaries. We have like, 5 middle schools and 3 high schools. And then a bunch of different alternative things. And so we call these building levels, and each one has a principal in it. And they're responsible for the budget in that building. Okay? Secondary principals typically view themselves more as a manager, and elementary principals typically view themselves as more responsible for teaching and learning. When I was in grad school, they told us principals were to be the instructional leaders in school. Now, we never see, especially in middle school, high school, see a principal take that role, but that's really their primary charge. And so if learning isn't up to par, generally they're responsible because they're supposed to be that person. Regards to that level, the role of building principal is demanding. Some principals normally must have advanced educational preparation and must possess administrative credential in order to serve as principal. As I shared, I have. Because of the complexities of the role, it's a time-consuming job with high stress. One reason I say, this is going to sound kind of crass, but the principal also is in charge of knocking heads. Superintendent never has to put up with a kid that's out of control or high crisis situations. That's a building level thing. For this reason, fewer individuals are interested in the job, and there are predictions of a shortage of school principals. Now, they make more money. I'm going to guess that head principals in Sioux Falls and our high schools make around this number right here. It seems like a lot, but they're responsible. This definitely opens the door for opportunities to those who have leadership skills and are willing to accept demanding responsibilities. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, there's going to be openings for you. Effective principals are the instructional leaders. There it is. For their schools are of critical importance in establish a positive teaching and learning and climate. And that climate has a lot to do with principals getting hired and fired. Is can they create a positive environment? The contact of secondary and school teachers with the school principal is usually considerably less than that of elementary teachers. However, at both levels, individuals seeking teaching positions are well advised to consider leadership abilities of the principal and their priorities before accepting a position. Because, yes, it seems like the principal works a lot closer with the teachers in the elementary. And then there's assistant principals and department heads and chairs, and we've studied that already. And then we get to you all. Teachers! The largest number of professionals in the school will be the teachers. Smaller intermediate schools may have only 1 or 2 teachers at each grade level. In large high schools, the number of teachers may be as many as 100 or more. In elementary school, it was typical that all teachers know each other and may converse on a regular basis. But in secondary school, teachers may only have a nodding acquaintance. You know what that is, a nodding? You nod that you know that they're from here. Teachers in other departments. Teachers from the informal power structure at the school. Although they do not have formal evaluation functions, the social power structure of teaching in school can certainly make the life of a new teacher either easier or more difficult, depending on the climate in the school. You need to understand that each school develops a particular culture that is a combination of the formal and informal power structures. This culture usually includes written and unwritten rules. And if this is new to you, then you haven't been paying attention to your school. Because teachers can have a lot to do with the climate and how the principal does and the culture and the way the building looks and how it operates. Teachers play a large role in that. And so that's... How about support staff? An important additional component of any school is the support staff. This usually consists of staff, front office, custodial staff. These are important individuals who keep the school functioning smoothly. The school secretary at the front office, staff usually handle all the records and files, order materials, take supplies. They're the first point of contact with someone interested in school. They can answer the most questions you might have. Okay, and I've often heard that this person really sets the climate more than any, is whoever is at that front of the school where the people enter it. And my wife has been a good barometer of this, of different places I've taught, and she quickly can form opinions about the climate of the school, the reception she gets from that secretary, whoever receives people. And let me say this to you, if you are in a school, that not only they should be received well, but there should be somebody there to receive them. And I can't tell you how many schools I go to visit student teachers, and there's nobody to receive you. That if you can find the office, quite often there's no one there. And that's a little unnerving, not only as a guest, but as a parent. I don't like that, to come into the school and have no one there to receive me. But where my kids go to school, that's our strength, that Our Lady at the front desk runs the school and is just such a blessing to have, because of her demeanor at that front desk. And then there's the custodial staff. They keep the school clean and can help locate needed furniture, such as desks and chairs and filing cabinets. They are often in charge of watching such things as violations of safety and fires. Needless to say, the support staff is critical in helping develop a satisfying work environment. When one of the authors has an administrative intern, one of the first pieces of advice given is to maintain a good relationship with the support staff. You should cultivate a good working relationship with them by treating them with respect. And I was told the same thing. Make friends right away with the principal or with the secretary and the custodian, because they're the ones, number one, they know what's going on in the school and they know how to get things done, unlike anybody else in the building. Everything else has a lot of bureaucracy. Those two groups, the secretary and the janitors, know how to get things done. And this is just a little diagram out of the textbook about how that works. The school board, and then the superintendent below that. He has assistant superintendents and building principals under him, and then they have people that are under them also. Okay? And there's some crossover here also, but that's the way it looks there. Okay? So how about some other influences in educational policy? Well, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution assigns authority for education to the states. The federal government has played a relatively limited role in education. So looks this has played a limited role. How about this? Over the years, the most important role of the federal government has been through the federal what? Look in your book, quick. Write that in there, yes. So what rulings they have? Well, the federal government has sought to have a more direct influence on educational policy at the state and local levels through the assurance of federal reports such as A Nation at Risk. And we studied this earlier in our course also, what that meant. And that was a ruling or finding that our schools were falling behind. So the Constitution then has this spending clause in it. And what is that? Well, what this means is that the federal government can influence state policy by attaching conditions to the funds they supply to the states under the claim that it's a general welfare of the people. Huh? Okay, one more time. This is what's interesting. That the Constitution's spending clause says that the states, the federal government has the right to assess taxes, charge money. And what that does, then they can influence that policy by attaching conditions saying, you want the money, honey? Here's what you got to do for it. And so they do this to their funds, and this is how they can control this is how they're going to control private schools, this is how they're going to control homeschoolers, is by saying, you know, in states, you don't get the money unless you do these things with those groups. And why? Because it's for the general welfare of the people, not the individual, for the general welfare of the people. And this is how they're going to exert undue influence on your local school, is with the money, honey. And it's going to come under the form of a spending clause that will give you federal dollars, and we are all such prostitutes that will gladly take their money and do what they tell us to do. Okay? So that's what's going to happen here. That's how they can control this. The United States Department of Ed, this is what they do. The role of the Department of Ed in the United States is to manage educational policy, provide federal leadership on educational issues, administer federal grants, and here again is what makes us prostitutes, and programs, and gather and disseminate statistics about education, and support and engage in research. So this was created that long ago. There's some people that don't think we need a United States Department of Ed, but as long as there's this, we'll put up with the Department of Ed. What are some other influences? Well, these, when we talked about before, the NEA and the AFT, and this is why. The NEA has approximately 2.7 million members. The AFT has 1.3. How many is that? 4 million. I assure you, they all vote the same way. They all vote for the same person, the same political party. So that's a lot of influence. And, oh, there's more. So if you're one of these members, these 4 million members, what do you do for a living? Oh, you're probably a teacher. Okay? And if you're a teacher, one of these 4 million teachers, who do you work with all day? Oh, kids, that's right. And if you have kids, how do you tend to influence them about voting if all 4 million of you vote the same way? I wonder how you'd persuade, which way you'd persuade your students to vote. Well, it doesn't matter. Professional teachers associations have no designated governance authority on federal educational policy. They do have considerable influence and power. Why? 4 million voters teaching about 50 million kids. Yeah. Understanding educational issues and change requires that you have a clear understanding of the role of professional teachers organizations. And I just told you what it was. And they also negotiate with the board. Local, this is a local thing. That for the most part, most school districts, the local, for example, you know, our state one is SDEA, and like in Sioux Falls we call it SFEA. Most places, the local one, the SFEA, does negotiating for salary. And wages and other conditions of employment are part of that. And evaluation practices, transfer policies, grievances, leave policies, class size, all of this. Did you know that? That's all negotiated by this group. Like the calendar. Do you know the school calendar is negotiated by the local teachers union? Transfer policies. Now, in your small schools, you don't know that, but it's big in Sioux Falls. How we're going to be evaluated, what kind of time off we get, how big our classes are. Do you know that the size of class is negotiated by your local thing? You don't think they have some power? And that same power is what they wield up here in votes and dollars and influencing kids? Yeah. And it don't seem right to me to have that much power, but they do. And then there's business leaders. What influence do they have? Well, they bring some of that same stuff in. So the governance issues. Who will control education? So you want to read page 358 about the control of schools. When you get on 358, you're going to have to answer those three questions in there, and I'm anxious to see what you come up with on this after you read this whole thing on who will control education, because it's quite interesting, and it really comes into play about politics and the influence of politics. So now let's make that big jump that makes everybody nervous. Financing education. The cost of education and how money should be allocated is the subject of much intense debate. The control of finance generally leads to the control of policies. Call it the golden rule. Those who have the gold make the rules. So, conservatives argue that schools do not need more money, and the solution is more efficient use of money allocated to education. Liberals argue that per capita funding of education in the U.S. is considerably lower than that of most highly industrialized nations. Do you understand these terms? Okay, here's the second things. This is number 2, and number 3 you get to look up and put definitions in your notes. Number 2, number 3, we had one earlier. And then in order to understand that debate, the following questions must be answered. How much does it cost? Who pays? How should it be collected? Yeah, sure. Okay, let's look at those questions. How much does it cost? Well, here's one estimate. $400 billion. Okay? It's 40% of the way to $1 trillion. So $400 billion, about 65% of the cost of education is for instruction and instruction-related purposes. And about 11% is for administration. And this is one that's often people criticize as too high. It shouldn't take 11% of our educational dollars to administrate. But that's what they spend. And about 18% for operations, operate the buildings, and then 5% for student services like special ed. Okay? This means instruction. This means like teachers. 60-65% are teachers. Okay? 11% administration, 18% operations, 5% services. You're going to want to know this. All right? Whoa. $8,310 per academic year per student in this country. Unfunded mandates when changes in programs are mandated by either the state or the federal government, but no dollars with them. It's called an unfunded mandate. In 2002, the federal budget has provided only 18% of the cost of SPED. That's an unfunded mandate. Federal law says you have to have special eds. This stands for special education. But they only provide 18% of the support for it. The rest has to be picked up by the state and the local. This is an unfunded mandate. Federal government says you must do this, doesn't pay. It comes to me in that thing of taxation without representation, that they make you do things, but they don't help you pay for them. That's what that means. So who pays for that? Local. 3 main sources of revenue to public schools. Anybody know what they are before we go on? Anyone? Anyone? Well, there's local sources, state government, and federal government. It used to be all this when we first started out with schools, if you looked at the history, and state, but now we all sit around with baby birds with our mouths wide open waiting for the federal government to drop money in our mouth. Okay? Saying, we'll do whatever. Just tell us what to do. Just give us the money. We've got to have more. We don't know what to do with it, but we've got to have more money. Give us more money, please, please, please. If they don't, they're bad people. Okay? That's the sources of it. Local, state, and federal money. And then traditionally, local sources have been made the largest contribution, followed by state and then feds, providing a relatively small share. However, in recent years, the states have taken on an increased responsibility. This mirrors the shift in control then from our local communities, the state government, and to our federal. Currently, state governments contribute about 50%, and local governments about 43%. totaling funding education. Where's the rest? From the feds. And for most of the 20th century, the major source of funding for school was property tax, as it is here in South Dakota. Property tax is based on the assessed value of all property found within the boundaries of that local school district. Okay. Let me tell you what this is. For example, in my house, I pay approximately $4,000 a year property tax. I've now lived here approximately, well, I've lived here, just say, I've lived here 23 years, just say 20 years, and I think I've averaged about $3,000 over that. That's $60,000 I've paid into this local taxes. You realize my kids go to private school, right? And I pay another $6,000 a year. Actually, it's about $65,000, but I'll say $6,000 a year. So I'm contributing $10,000 per year to education in my community. This finance model also results in significant variations in per pupil spending from one district to another. Like in some regions, districts with high assessed property values spent almost twice the amount of money per student in their low assessed property value neighbors. And that's been a long thing. Lots and lots of court battles over that is, I want to live in this one neighborhood because their property values are high and the school's really good. Now the thing they don't tell you about is also that money with that, the high property values, those kids bring a different mentality to school. This is that whole thing that we can talk about for the next 5 years about the impoverished neighborhoods and schools versus the high-income places. And what some will have you believe is it has to do with these property values at the school being better. But it has just as much to do with the mentality that kids bring to school, the value they put on education and learning that the parents do and stuff like that. For example, in the suburbs around Chicago, the Rondout School District spends $22,000 per student in recent year, where the Zion Elementary School District spend $86.75 per student. Okay, here's my bias again. What's wrong with this? If they want to live in that neighborhood and spray, their taxes are higher also. Their taxes are much higher. Isn't that not okay? I was whining here before about my contribution, but I choose that. Can my kids go to a better school? Well, with federal law and the courts have found that everybody has to have equal, no matter where you live. And so that's for why we've had an exit of people from our public schools to our private schools enter homeschooling, is because if you want a better school, a better education than what's being provided, that's what you had to do. Now, this textbook tells you that's not true. This textbook had a chapter a while back that told you that's not true. But that is why people leave the public schools. At state level funding, it comes from two primary sources of revenue, income tax and sales tax. And federal revenue has two types of grants, a categorical grant and a block grant. So how are funds allocated then? They get to decide. They have the power to do that. The usual way of determining is the average daily attendance. It's really called average daily membership. And this is what we count, how we decide. Right now the state support in South Dakota is about $4,700 per year. So that's why, especially in our small districts or all districts, so if I have one student transfers from, well, a common one we've had is, from this school over to this school, $4,700 go with them. Okay, that's one. But just say it's 10 students, $47,000 walk out your door. In Sioux Falls, we have a huge influx of people in. We have a large pool of money comes to Sioux Falls from outside districts because their kids open enroll in Sioux Falls. And it's all your support from the state is built on average daily attendance, average daily membership. You realize the same thing is how we determine what class you're in for sports, AA, A, or B, deals with average daily attendance, average daily membership. That's also how you're funded. And that's why if somebody's moving out of your district, you want them to stay until they do the head count, which is usually in October when this is established. So you know that? Somebody wants to move away, tell them to wait until you count them so you get the $4,700 for that year. How can it be influenced by local schools? Well, It's influenced because if you have a really good school, people want to come to it, want to be part of it, and leave other schools. Fair? I don't know. Competition is what builds. How about issues in school finance? Well, here's that thing, that equity versus adequacy. Is money available to provide additional funds? How about teacher compensation? What is enough money? And then that evidence-based model or successful school model, professional judgment model. How do we decide equity versus adequacy? In other words, what's adequate? Just had a lawsuit in South Dakota where a bunch of schools got together and sued the state saying there wasn't enough money, and the courts found this. It was adequate. Did they say it was the best? No. They said what's funded is adequate. Popular? No. Today, the adequacy models have led to estimates of expenditures for the schools that exceed current funding levels. For example, in New York, the estimate cost of the implementation of an adequacy formula would be an additional $8.4 billion per year. And in Maryland, 2 studies have been conducted using different models. One estimated that the state needed to increase spending by 34 and the other by 44 to be adequate. Okay? The same thing. If we put more money, it will be better. Don't have evidence of it. Can't find evidence of it because there are places they've thrown a lot more money, like in South Dakota and our Indian reservations. What they get to educate their kids is twice what we do here in Sioux Falls, but their outcomes are less. But for the most part, the underlying mentality is in our schools will make them better, even though we don't have any statistical support for that. This led to opposition from some fiscal conservatives who claim that there is little evidence of relationship between money and achievement. That's page 364. Is money available to provide additional funds? Please read that. Again, you get to read this bias part about school funding on page 364 and then answer 2 questions. Kind of makes me sick. I disagree with it, but it'd be good for you to read that. And then teacher compensation. Education is labor intensive, and the largest portion of the school district budget is devoted to teacher salaries. And that's important because we have research that says the lower the teacher-student ratio, the better. Proposals link teacher compensation with performance. We've looked at that. Traditionally, teacher salaries have been based on what is called a single salary schedule, and that is time and education is more money, increased dollars. And so we've looked at this before about that proposal. We call it merit pay. We looked at that a few chapters back. So this is a big sticking point because remember what we talked about, who had the power here? This is what's really interesting. Again, this group exerts a large amount of pressure, and yet they directly are affected by these things. Now, is this NEA group, are they for merit pay? Are they for compensation with performance, NEA? You check on that and tell me if they're for this. Okay. So here's a pretty good summary on it. Take you through that. And then reflection. I want you to do these reflections at the end too. There's three more reflections here. Okay, and how school are financed here on chapter 13. So big chapter. A lot of information on running schools and financing. A lot of bias.